Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive into modern Indian history. This one is going to be particularly interesting for our UPSC aspirants out there gearing up for GS1 Modern History, and of course, anyone else who's fascinated by this pivotal period in India's past. If you're joining us for the first time, we're picking up where we left off in our last deep dive, so if you haven't already, go back and check that one out first, and while you're at it, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on all our future deep dives. Now, today, we're traveling back in time to India in the early 1900s. Picture it, a time of immense political and social change. The nationalist movement is gaining momentum, and education emerges as a key battleground. The British, realizing the power of education to shape minds and influence the future, they responded with a very calculated move. A piece of legislation known as the Indian Universities Act of 1904. Now, this act wasn't just about, boring legal clauses and administrative tweaks. This was about power, control, and the very future of India. To help us unpack the intricacies of this act and its lasting impact, we have our expert back with us.
It's great to be back. You've really set the stage beautifully. The early 1900s, as you said, were a time of growing unease for the British Raj. They were really starting to feel the heat of rising nationalist sentiment. And you're right, they saw education as a potential breeding ground for dissent.
It makes sense, right? Educated Indians could pose a real challenge to their authority. So how did this fear, this anxiety, how did it manifest in concrete actions?
Well, they came to believe that those educational institutions that weren't directly under their control, that those were becoming hotbeds for anti-British sentiment. Places where nationalist ideas could spread and potentially threaten their grip on power. And that's where the Indian Universities Act of 1904 comes in. It was their attempt to, you could say, rein in this perceived threat, to assert their dominance over the education system.
So it wasn't just about education then. It was about power, control, shaping the narrative. I mean, this is starting to sound more like a political maneuver than an educational reform.
Oh, absolutely. The British, of course, they tried to frame it as, a measure to improve quality and efficiency in Indian universities. To bring them up to par with, Western standards. But for many Indians, and particularly those involved in the burgeoning nationalist movement, it was seen as a blatant attempt to stifle dissent, to basically produce a class of graduates who would be, loyal to the empire.
It's like a classic case of saying one thing and doing another, right?
Yeah.
They're talking about uplifting Indian education, but at the same time, they're tightening their control over it.
Exactly. And to really understand what this act was all about, I think we need to dig into its key provisions and really examine their impact on the Indian education landscape.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack some of these key positions. I'm really curious about this powerful Senate that the Act established to oversee the universities. Can you tell us more about what this Senate actually did, and how did it affect the whole power dynamics within the education system?
Sure. So the Senate, you can think of it as the Raj's tool for centralized control. It gave the British Raj pretty much the final say in almost everything from, curriculum design and faculty appointments to, just the overall functioning of the universities. This effectively concentrated power in the hands of the British government and left very little room for, independent decision-making within Indian academia.
So even though these are Indian universities on paper, the real power rested with the British through this Senate.
Exactly. And, this control, it actually extended beyond the universities themselves. The Act also introduced the concept of affiliated colleges, which, on the surface, you might think, okay, this is a step towards expanding access to higher education.
Right. More colleges, more opportunities for students seems like a good thing.
Right. It seems that way. But it wasn't quite that simple.
I had a feeling there might be more to it.
Oh, there definitely was. So yes, affiliation did expand access to some extent, but it came with strings attached.
Oh, I bet it did.
It enforced a standardized curriculum across all those affiliated colleges. So basically, everyone, regardless of their location, had to adhere to this British-approved syllabus.
I see. So more access, but less diversity of thought, right? It's like they were trying to control the narrative, make sure everyone was learning the same thing the British way.
Exactly. It was all about ensuring uniformity, minimizing the possibility of any deviations from that approved curriculum.
So would it be accurate to say that they wanted to create a system where a physics course in Calcutta would follow the same exact syllabus as one in Madras?
That's a perfect example. The affiliation system was all about that kind of uniformity.
It's almost like they wanted to create like a mass-produced, standardized version of education.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And this drive for standardization, it went beyond just course content. The act also formally recognized universities and standardized degrees,
Nope.
which, on one hand, it did bring some consistency and legal standing to these institutions.
Right, so it's like they were trying to establish a more structured,
Yeah.
more regulated system. But there's always a flip side, isn't there?
There is this formal recognition, this standardization. It also meant stricter control over examinations, over qualifications, the whole process of earning a degree. The Raj, they set the standards, and they controlled who met them.
It's like they were creating a system where they held all the cards.
Exactly.
They defined what constituted a valid education, and then they controlled all the mechanisms to make sure it aligned with their objective.
Precisely. And this control, it extended even to the individuals responsible for imparting knowledge, the faculty. The act gave the government increased power to appoint and, crucially, to remove faculty members.
Oh, wow. So they controlled not just what was being taught, but also who was teaching it.
Exactly. And this, as you can imagine, had a chilling effect on academic freedom. Professors knew that expressing dissenting views or, challenging the colonial narrative in any way, it could jeopardize their positions.
It must have been a very stifling environment for academics.
It was. It definitely wasn't an environment that encouraged free thought or critical inquiry.
So basically, they were trying to create a system that would produce graduates who would just accept the British Raj and its policies without question.
You got it.
But we can't forget that all of this is happening against the backdrop of rising nationalism. Indians weren't just going to sit back and passively accept all of this, right?
You're absolutely right. The nationalist response to this act was fierce and multifaceted. And that's something we'll delve into right after a quick break. The Indian nationalist movement, remember, it was really gaining steam during this period, and they absolutely did not take the Indian Universities Act lying down. They saw it for what it was, a blatant attempt to curb their intellectual freedom, to undermine their aspirations for self-rule.
Yeah, I can only imagine. This act must have felt like, I don't know, pouring gasoline on a fire. Were there any specific figures or groups that really led the charge against it?
Oh, absolutely. Prominent nationalist leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, he was very vocal in his opposition. Gokhale, known for his more moderate stance, his advocacy for reform within the existing system, even he called it a retrograde measure. So that really shows you how deeply this act resonated with those who, envisioned a different future for India.
So even those who weren't calling for complete independence, they saw this as a step in the wrong direction.
Exactly. The British really miscalculated. They underestimated that growing sense of national consciousness among Indians. The act really became a rallying point for nationalists. It united them in opposition to what they saw as an attack on their right to, shape their own destiny.
It's funny how an act that was designed to control education actually ended up galvanizing the very movement they were trying to suppress.
It's like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. The more they tried to exert control, the stronger the resistance became. This act, while it was intended to reinforce British dominance, it really inadvertently helped to solidify the nationalist movement. And you could argue it paved the way for an independent India.
Wow, so it really backfired on them in a way. Now, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You said that the present-day University Grants Commission, the UGC, that its roots can actually be traced back to this 1904 Act. Can you talk a little bit more about that? That seems like a pretty significant link.
It is. And it speaks to that, complex legacy of this particular act. So the UGC, as we know it today, was established in 1956, right? Long after India gained independence. But those seeds, the seeds of a centralized body, overseeing university funding and development, those were sown by the 1904 Act.
So even though the act was designed for a very different purpose.
Right. That centralized structure, it provided, in a way, a framework that was later adapted and built upon for a new India.
That's fascinating. So the 1904 Act, it inadvertently laid the groundwork for an institution that plays such a crucial role in Indian higher education today.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. Even acts that are, born out of a colonial mindset can have these unintended consequences that shape the future in really unexpected ways.
Yeah, it's a reminder that those in power, sometimes they set things in motion without realizing the full extent of their impact or how those actions might be reinterpreted and repurposed down the line.
Right.
It's like almost a paradox, an act that was designed to limit intellectual freedom
Yeah.
actually contributed to a system that, in a different context, fosters academic growth and development.
Absolutely. It's also a testament to the adaptability, the resilience of the Indian education system. It took a structure born out of colonial control and transformed it into an instrument for progress and development.
And this brings us to, I think, a crucial question, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there. How should we view this act through a historical lens? Is it simply an instrument of oppression, or is there a more nuanced perspective that we should be considering?
Well, it's important, I think, to approach these historical events with nuance and to avoid those kind of simplistic judgments. While the 1904 Act was undoubtedly, a tool of colonial control, it also had this lasting impact on the structure of Indian higher education. Understanding this duality, I think, is essential for anyone who's studying this period.
But for our listeners who are preparing for those UPSC exams, this act, it's not just, a dry historical event. It's a complex issue with these threads that weave into the very fabric of modern India.
Exactly.
And to really grasp the significance of this act, I think we need to understand the context in which it was created. Let's step back in time a bit, explore the events that led to its enactment.
I agree. The 1904 Act, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It was very much a product of its time, a culmination of various factors and events that shaped the political and social landscape of British India. And there's one event in particular that I think offers a fascinating glimpse into the motivations behind this act.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What event are we talking about?
So it all goes back to a meeting up in the foothills of the Himalayas. In 1901, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India at the time, he convened this roundtable conference in Shimla. This gathering, it was focused on addressing what the British perceived as, flaws in the Indian education system. And it really laid the groundwork for the 1904 Act.
So this conference was, in essence, a precursor to the Act. And Curzon, being the viceroy, obviously played a key role in shaping its agenda. It's interesting. Curzon is often remembered for his administrative reforms and his efforts to preserve India's cultural heritage. But his approach to education seems to sort of contradict that image.
It's a good point. Curzon was a complex figure. While he did implement some reforms that, were beneficial, he was also a staunch believer in British supremacy. And he was deeply committed to strengthening the Raj's control over, all aspects of Indian life.
So for him, education wasn't just about imparting knowledge. It was a tool for control, a way to perpetuate British rule.
Precisely. He saw education as a way to shape the minds of young Indians, to mold them into, loyal subjects of the empire. And the 1904 Act, with its emphasis on control and standardization, that was really the embodiment of that vision.
It's interesting how someone who, on the surface, seemed to appreciate India's culture, its heritage, could still be so driven by this, this colonial mindset.
Right. It highlights the inherent contradictions within the British Raj. They wanted to preserve certain aspects of India while simultaneously controlling and manipulating others to serve their own interests.
It's like a classic example of paternalism.
Okay.
And the 1904 Act, I think, really epitomizes that paternalistic approach to education. This whole deep dive is really starting to paint a comprehensive picture of this period. We've explored the Act itself, its impact on Indian society, the nationalist backlash, the political motivations behind its creation. But there's still, I think, one crucial question that's lingering in the air, a question that goes beyond just the historical context and speaks to, I think, the very essence of education itself.
I'm listening.
How do we balance the need for standardized education systems with the importance of academic freedom and critical thinking? It's a dilemma that we still grapple with today. It's a question that's been debated for centuries.
It has.
Can we have a system that, provides a strong foundation of knowledge, but also encourages students to think critically, to challenge assumptions, to push the boundaries?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The 1904 Act, for all its flaws, it did bring a certain degree of standardization and structure to the Indian education system, but that came at a cost, right? The cost of stifling intellectual curiosity and independent thought. It's like, imagine trying to cultivate a garden, but you only plant rows of identical flowers.
I see what you mean.
You might achieve a sense of order and uniformity, but you lose that vibrant diversity, the potential for, unexpected beauty.
That's a great analogy. So how do we strike that balance then? How do we create an educational environment that equips students with essential knowledge, but also empowers them to be, critical thinkers, innovators, those who can challenge the status quo?
Well, it's a question that educators and policymakers are still grappling with today. But I think one key is to move away from this emphasis on rote learning and really focus on fostering critical thinking skills from a young age. Encourage students to question, analyze, form their own opinions.
So instead of just memorizing facts and figures,
Right.
we need to teach them how to think for themselves, how to evaluate information, how to discern fact from fiction, to not just blindly accept what they're told,
Right.
but to dig deeper, to form their own conclusions.
It's about nurturing that spirit of inquiry, that intellectual curiosity. And that starts with creating an environment where students feel safe to challenge conventional wisdom, to voice dissenting opinions, to explore different perspectives without fear of reprisal.
It sounds like it requires a pretty fundamental shift in the way we think about education.
It does.
It's about moving away from this idea of students as passive recipients of knowledge and embracing the idea of students as, active participants in the learning process.
That's the key. It's about empowering students to be active learners, to engage with the material, to ask questions, to seek answers beyond the confines of a textbook.
And maybe even more importantly, to be able to apply that knowledge to real-world situations, to be problem solvers, to be the ones who come up with those innovative solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where I think the 1904 Act, despite its limitations, offers us a really valuable lesson. It reminds us of the incredible power of education to shape individuals, to shape societies, but it also serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting the dangers of a system that prioritizes control over critical thinking and intellectual freedom.
Well said.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's safe to say the Indian Universities Act of 1904 wasn't just a piece of legislation. It was a real turning point in the history of Indian education, a battleground where, colonial control clashed with the aspirations of a nation yearning for freedom. And while its legacy is complex, I think it offers invaluable lessons for us today as we try to navigate the challenges of creating an education system that empowers, inspires, and equips students for the future.
It's been a fascinating journey.
To all our amazing listeners out there, especially our dedicated UPSC aspirants, I hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in India's past. Remember, understanding history. It's not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about connecting those dots, analyzing those different perspectives, and drawing those meaningful conclusions. That can inform our understanding of the present and help us shape our vision for the future. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us today and sharing their incredible knowledge and insights.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future deep dives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains buzzing.